Thank you everyone for joining us for the follow-ups to the communication workshop we held last month. Maybe we should introduce ourselves to start. I'm Abbey Wick, the NDSU Extension Soil Health Specialist. So I work with county agents, I work with farmers, I work with anything related to soil health in the region and the state of North Dakota in particular. And with me is...
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Johnson, and I'm an NDSU Extension agent based in Steele County, North Dakota. So my office is headquartered in the county seat of Findlay. And I also am a farmer on the side. I raise livestock and crops with my family, so it's great to be here this morning. And also joining us virtually, we have the one and only Lee Briese. And so, good morning, Lee. Can you introduce yourself to the team this morning?
Hello, everybody. Lee Briese. I'm a crop consultant from Central North Dakota. I work directly with farmers and have been doing this for about 20 years. And been doing some presentations for the last few years to try to spread the word about several different things.
Lee, you're a very visual person, visual teacher, and you use analogies to convey your ideas or different concepts. How did you discover this and then refine it to fit your needs?
The thing for me really was to understand that that's how I learn. That's how I communicate on a daily basis. That's what we talked about in the video, is that's what I do every day is I talk. And I'm trying to talk with my hands right now, and it doesn't work on Zoom, right? So it's one of those things, just understanding that that was how I speak and how I talk and how I communicate and how I understand things. In agriculture, it seems to work really well because a lot of the farmers that I work with are also very visual people. So communicating that message was all about finding ways to make it make sense to them and to use things like talking about wrenches and talking about cars and talking about whatever, and using those as analogies for the types of things that we're talking about that we can't see, especially microorganism things or long-term things or whatever. So it's just something I recognized in myself. In the Zoom format challenges me because I can't talk with my hands and it's harder to paint those pictures.
You know, you brought up a great point. It's with Zoom, it's really tough to I talk with my hands too, and you do as well. So how has your style had to change based on this new virtual meeting setting and interactions with people? What are you working on to better yourself and to better suit the virtual format?
Still working on that. Don't really have the answers, but you'll see, like today I picked a different background and maybe shouldn't have, but what I've done with my presentations in recent years and more so with Zoom now is instead of a bunch of words, I'm using pictures that try to help me tell a story. And so I'm trying to put some of those pictures into my presentations so that it helps build that visual element into it. And then I'm using my mouse whenever I'm the moderator or the host at that time to point those things out like you would a laser pointer and that kind of stuff. But I have to tone it down a little bit because sometimes I get kind of wild and the mouse is going all over. So I'm still learning.
Well, let's put you on the hot seat, Angie, if you aren't already being on stage. But you work a lot alongside farmers, and you were telling me this great story about this badger pelt that you have on your desk for those one-to-one interactions when they come into your office. So can you talk a little bit about what your style is when it's face-to-face, but then we'll talk a little bit about how you've changed that for virtual format.
You had to bring up the badger, didn't you? So I'm a very one-on-one person. I do well with one-on-one interactions, and I enjoy visiting with farmers. And the story behind the badger is that people come in and they need to trust us. They need to trust their NDSU extension agent, their specialist, whoever that person is, and in order to start a conversation, we need to have some common ground. And so besides the weather, what's one thing in North Dakota that we can all enjoy and have some commonalities with? And that's wildlife. And so that badger pelt that I have sitting on my desk is actually there for a reason. It's really to start that conversation, because the first thing a producer or anyone that stops in is, oh my gosh, did you trap that badger? I remember seeing those as kids. And pretty soon we start opening up this whole conversation of their farm, and it gets to be so much deeper than just the badger, but it's really opening up that mindset of we're relatable, we have some commonalities, we're able to start talking to each other and communicate and trust each other. I feel more comfortable with you, and the producer feels more comfortable with me because we're relatable. So that's the story behind the badger pelt. Thanks for bringing it up.
Oh, you're welcome. And so if you don't have a badger pelt, what maybe are some other things that you could consider for face-to-face that would create that connection?
Be yourself. You know, we're all in agriculture because we're passionate about it. And so I really recommend, and this is hard, I need to start taking my own advice. So some of you out there are going to say, ha, finally, Angie, you're listening to yourself. But you truly do need to be yourself. And so in Lee's yo-yo video, you have to utilize what you have. You are born with skill sets that are going to shine through, and you have to own them. And that's what's really going to make you relatable, genuine. I'm very humble with the work I do, and producers appreciate that and value that I support them in any way, shape, and form. And so that's kind of some of my thoughts, Abby.
Well, and I was thinking a little bit too, as you talk about your badger pelt, which sorry to bring that up if you didn't want to talk about it. But for me, you know, that thing that I have in person is my shovel. I mean, everybody knows how to use a shovel. They've used them to dig holes and been frustrated with putting in fence. They've used them to plant a garden. They've used them for anything around the yard. And so for me, that's almost what I bring, you know, with me to the field or wherever. Not only does it give me something to kind of hold on to ground myself, but it also helps me have that one thing that's common that we can share with the person we're talking with on those one-on-one interactions. Now, I can't bring a shovel to Zoom, and you can't bring your badger pelt to Zoom, Angie. So what have you done to create this virtual format where you're using something like that to create a conversation or to build trust?
So something that I've found really interesting is I was always so self-conscious on Zoom if I didn't have a background up, because all you see is my disaster of a desk. And I've come to learn that I've become more comfortable with not only my natural background, my natural habitat, so to speak, but with others too. And so, you know, looking at the dirt workshop a few weeks ago, there were some producers and even specialists that had a vast array of wildlife hanging in their office or their room or wherever they were at, utilizing Zoom. And I felt a sense of comfort. We have something relatable. I love wildlife. I know where you're coming from. I feel like I could have a comfortable conversation with you. So that's one thing is again, owning who you are, being comfortable, finding those pieces that make you feel, this sounds silly, but make you feel brave to talk to that person. You know, don't be afraid don't analyze those backgrounds, because my desk is messy. It's a chaotic mess, but it's also something that makes me more comfortable.
Well, your desk is probably a mess like mine is, because you likely are never there or were never there pre-COVID. So things tend to pile up in your office. Now, I guess, you know, in working with colleagues or farmers, you know, in an online meeting, how do you get them to open up and share ideas? I think this was a question from the workshop in December. And so maybe let's go to Lee for this. How do you get people to open up in an online meeting if you see colleagues or farmers on that meeting as well?
Well, one of the things that I try to do is I change my Zoom window a little bit, so I don't have it on full screen. I have it on minimized screen, and I can have the chat open. And I can see people through the chat, or I can see more people through the visual part of it. You can open up that window a little bit. But I'm looking for people that I know to call them out and to just engage them directly. That's one of the main things. But part of it too, for me, when I'm doing a meeting, is to set it up from the beginning. This is one of the things we were trying to do with the chat earlier on, is just say, hey, be ready to chat, be part of this, jump in whenever you want, that whole thing, and set it up and give people the notice, that the permission, it's okay to interrupt me. Because with some of the presentations, we're used to waiting for questions to the end. And if you want interaction right away, tell people you want interaction right away, because they're conditioned to wait till the end. And then the other thing that I've seen with interactions is over Zoom, it takes longer for that to happen. Is you've got to find the mouse, you got to find the mute button, you got to unclick the mute button, then you got to jump in. So beyond the point of waiting for somebody to jump in, you have to give people a little bit of time to go ahead and do that. Now, I know that in person, silence is uncomfortable, and it seems like on Zoom or on your computer, the silence is even more uncomfortable for everybody. So make sure that you're giving that warning and that heads up. That's one of the things that I've done, is say, okay, in a minute here, we're going to go to the chat, or I just saw something, or if you have a question, we're going to pause here in a bit to do that, so that you give people the time to find those cues, type it in, get ready, and then you don't have that awkward pause.
Yeah, that's great advice. That awkward pause on Zoom is real, and 5 seconds can seem like a minute and a half in those scenarios. So it is really challenging. Maybe you just figure out a way to take 3 or 4 deep breaths to let that pause happen, and make sure that you allow people time to answer. Because I think there are a lot of people on Zoom that are very concerned about talking over other people as well. So they don't want to start talking at the same time, and maybe that's where calling people out that from the chat or from that list, like you're saying, can help them kind of interact in a good way. One of the things I try on Zoom, and this kind of relates back to what I do in person, is I try to keep it really personable, because that's just how I am, and that's maybe how people expect me to be online as well. So what I do is I just start sharing what's going on with me at the start of Zoom, and that was easy to do, as a lot of us were facing some of these issues with COVID and trying to figure out how we were going to redirect everything, and struggling with teaching kids at home while at the same time trying to be full-time employees. And so I try to share some of those things, and let people know that I am a normal person that's dealing with a lot of these things as well. But I also, so I'll ask other people questions about how things are going with them. But I think it's important to make sure you don't ask those really personal questions online. I think, Angie, you've got some thoughts on this too, on what do you ask and what do you not ask of people when you see them?
Yeah, so Abby, you make a great point. When I've always been inquisitive by nature. I was that student that had to sit up front because I need to hear, I need to focus and be engaged, but I also have a million follow-up questions to ask after the fact. So don't just lecture to me. I want to ask some questions, but there gets to be a point where, with the work that we do as agriculturalists and educators, is that we can almost get to the point where we pick too much. And what I mean by that is, like Abby mentioned, getting a little bit too picky, too trying to just dig. And instead of dig, we want to seek to understand and learn by that, and also feed into their passion. So that's something that I do that I should have mentioned earlier, is I'm very inquisitive. I love asking questions, but there is a fine line between picking and getting at someone to open up versus just genuinely learning from someone and learning about their operation or the practices that they do, and reminding them that we're there to empower them and help them make some decisions. And so those are what I would call healthy questions to get the conversation going.
So maybe Lee, are there any questions that you just wouldn't ask that are off limits for somebody in public in a Zoom format or in person in front of other people? Are there questions that are just you do not ask those in front of other people?
Yeah, you kind of put me on the spot there. I think there are some. Anything financial right away is going to be an issue. Anything health-wise, I don't think you want to put that out there to anybody. Those types of things. Something that you're comfortable having a conversation in public with is probably okay. But if it's a side conversation, understand it's one of those things. The other thing for me is you have to read people in a lot of these panel discussions where we're calling on people more often than I would in something rather like this, is pay attention to their video camera. And if they're sitting there going, no, don't ask me, well, okay, then let it go. Or you can see their expressions on that too. I think that's important. So some of the meetings I do like to turn off the share screen option and just look at all the cameras and do go from there, because it gives me audience feedback. And if you see somebody nodding, if you're in the audience in a live thing and you're nodding, I'm going to call on you. If you're doing the same thing in Zoom, I'm probably going to call on you there too, because that's almost giving me permission to do that.
Yeah, so maybe we should go to the chat. Let's get some more engagement online between the chat and the Q&A. In the chat, maybe you put a question in there that you like to ask. What's your kind of opener question to make people comfortable and to have those conversations? And let's build up a bank of questions that we can all look at and ask in the future when we kind of struggle with some of those first interactions. So in the chat, put those questions. And then while you're at it, if you have some other questions that you want to ask Lee or Angie or me, please put those in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll just keep diving back into the ones from December and answering some of those questions that we didn't get to answer before. But I'm curious to see what people say. What's their opening question? And I'm not sure if I would even know could pinpoint what my opening question is, other than how's it going today? And maybe that's just a real general, just generic one. But sometimes it's okay to ask that. I know that one question that I do not ask is I don't like to ask people in front of others about how their crops did. Because the state is so variable as far as climate, and some people are in a drought, some people had too much moisture. So if even 10 miles away, those farming operations can be really different. And so I try not to ask people specifically about that. Something you can interpret back, that financial type information that Lee was talking about, where if they had a poor crop, you can back out that they probably didn't make, money on that field this year, or we're having some issues there. So anything that relates back to financial, I don't ask. And certainly anything that's shared with me that's financial, I never, ever share with anybody else. And you've had that too before, Angie, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as we all know, the agriculture industry, I mean, we've seen our ups and downs, and we're going to continue to see that. And so the struggles are real, and some of the things that we want producers to work with us, and if that means they need to confide in us, then that's what I want. If you have something that you need to get off your chest and talk about, we're there for you on that aspect as well. So it works both ways, and we work for you and respect you. So I value that piece very, very much and have high respect for it.
So maybe let's go to the next, kind of tip for what do you do on Zoom? And Angie, maybe you have some thoughts on that as to what other tips that we could have?
Sure. So, Lee talked a little bit about, having that camera on, and it's true, right? So if I'm giving a presentation, just like we talked about at our first communication workshop, I get so much joy, should I say, when I see a head nod or a great big smile or some type of interaction when you have that camera on. That helps me feel like I'm doing my job, other than just hurrying up to try to get through this because no one really cares and no one's paying attention, and I just need to get this over with and talk really fast, and hopefully it's done. But having that camera on so we can actually see you is important. The other thing, though, is Zoom fatigue. It's real, okay? And the reason why, it's kind of a two-edged sword. So it's nice to have your camera on so the presenter can actually see you and get some of that visual response that we crave as a presenter. But in the same token, it is exhausting to try and look through everybody's video camera to see how everyone's facial expressions are, if they're listening, if they're not, if they're happy, mad, sad. It is exhausting for our eyes and our brain to look through that. And so I really value when we have the opportunity to get into smaller groups, because then we don't have so many cameras on. And so, like I said, there's some give and take with the camera situation, but I think in small groups it works just fantastic, because then we get that feedback we're craving. And so the other thing Lee talked about is the dreaded awkward silence. I cannot stand the awkward silence, but I'm very open about that. I try and joke about it, and I need to be cognizant and aware to give people time to process, because we do that naturally when we're presenting face to face, right? We watch for the head nods and hopefully not the eye rolls, but we watch for that, and through Zoom it's so much harder. And so to really be patient, give some time for people to think, and you're not, I always was worried that I would be annoying you by having that awkward silence, but really if you're there, you're actively participating, you're there for a reason. And so I shouldn't be afraid to give you a few minutes to really think and compile your thoughts.
Yeah, that's great advice. It can be very awkward, but maybe it's mainly awkward for the person hosting the meeting. And it's not as awkward for other people. Yeah, Lee.
Can I jump in on there? I think one of the points that Angie made just now was really, really critical. This speeding up thing. I think a lot of presenters do that, especially without any reaction from the audience, or basically with Zoom, you don't have an audience. So be very conscious of when you start talking fast. And she actually did it as an example there, if you paid attention. She said like 7 sentences in one breath. So that's one of those things, like if you notice that you're trying to get out all your words before you take a breath, slow down, stop, and take a breath and give it time. People are in the meeting. They're there. They are, you're not getting the feedback necessarily, but be cognizant to slow down and pay attention to it. And again, leaving that pause. If you don't leave a pause, how does anybody jump in?
Yeah, that's great advice. I've caught myself in meetings before where I've just whipped right through the information, and then I get to the end and everybody's exhausted. You know, they've heard too much content. There's no time to react. There's no time to have a conversation. And so it is good to stop. And you don't necessarily have to fill that space with, does anyone have any questions? But you could just pause and just let it be open space, which I think is okay too. But it is challenging. It's a whole new format for us, I think, in a lot of ways. Not only are you trying to talk to a screen without a lot of interaction, but it can be very challenging. So I'm trying to think if I would love to have some questions in the Q&A, because we do want to guide this towards you. We've been about a half hour into this meeting, and we'd love to answer your questions or get some feedback from you. And here comes a question. This is great. So let's see who gets this one. Now I'm putting the pressure on. Briese is behind the scenes, and he's been typing in the questions for us. I'm putting pressure on him to type fast. But okay, so this would be. Oh, go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, I was going to give you time by saying something else. I remember one of the questions from before we had was about PowerPoints. When you're not in control of the meeting and you have your set time and you're supposed to give a PowerPoint, and that's what's expected of you, and you're just one of the presenters or participants. I think this came from a student actually, and they just really didn't have any control over it. And one of the things I had that I've been thinking about with that is understand that you're not giving a PowerPoint to give a PowerPoint. You're using the PowerPoint to tell a story, right? So keep in mind that telling a story over Zoom is going to be different than you do telling a story in person. And one of the things that I want people to be aware of is keep an eye on how you build your PowerPoint. And I would encourage people to, again, go back to that singular message, that one message, because hopefully you do get some interaction. But if you've timed your PowerPoint, it takes you 25 minutes in your half-hour presentation, and now you get conversation, guess what? You're not going to make it anymore. And then you do rush or try to hurry up and get there. So I'd like to encourage people to take a point and look at it and say, okay, what is my one message? How can I tell this message if I don't have, how many slides do I actually have to need to tell the message? Can I do it in 2 or 3 or 4 instead of 24 or 23? And that allows time for that.
Lee, I think you bring up a great point in the fact that we really have to be very, very intentional now about what is our one message. You know, I think in face-to-face situations, obviously our goal would be to, what is our one message? But I feel like we had a little bit more leeway because we could have those side conversations. They were a little bit more, they felt more normal because we're there together as an audience. But now that's not necessarily the case. And so we really have to be aware of what is our key message that our participants are going to take away from this, because this is the chunk of time I have, and we need to utilize that and not waste their time. So I think that's a really great point, is to be intentional about what's that key message so we don't do information dump and overload in our participants. And so to follow up with that, one of the questions is, how do those who use a lot of body language when they present fit to this online format? And if Abby, you got a good answer for this, or Lee? I guess Abby and I were talking a little bit before the show started, and I said I've never done so many presentations in my life where I've had to sit down. And that is just, it's not normal to have to sit and do a presentation. And so I think, I don't know if I would ever consider one, but they have those standing desks now, and maybe that's something where you need to try that on for size, so to speak, and give that an opportunity so you could still move and be able to stand up and just give you that experience that we're so used to and is actually better for us in the long run. So I guess that would be something that I would try and maybe even consider for myself, is to be able to stand up when giving presentations online.
Yeah, I think for me, for the body language, I do use a bit of body language, but I think more on Zoom, it's about your expression. And if you can't use your hands, now you really need to focus on your face. And what are you doing with your face? And I think in a time where a lot of us are wearing masks and it's difficult to see half of our face anyways, but on Zoom, we can show our whole face. And I think people are dying to see those smiles and that interaction and what they're seeing in your eyes. And so focusing on what you're doing with your face and your upper body versus your hands and your body language that way can be really, really effective. And so Lee, I don't know if you have some thoughts too on that because you use your hands quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to restrain my hands because with the virtual background, they detract more than they add to it. The other thing that I've just tried to do is try to extend that into my analogies or my visual pictures, trying to paint a visual picture through the storytelling. Again, I see the presentation as you're trying to tell a story, whether you're telling a story about your research or you're telling a story about conservation or you're telling a story about how to tell stories, you're still telling a story. So everything that you're doing is just a tool. So what is it that you're using your hands for? How are you what are you using them to tell? What's the point? So try to figure out what you're trying to say with your hands and do it in a different way.
So we've got another question here on kind of the logistics of working with Zoom on is there a way to deal with a pileup of responses when you open it up to the chat? So clearly you can see in our chat here we have over 100 things going on in there and some things in the Q&A, and that can be overwhelming. One of the things that I've tried to do is I try to have co-hosts. So there are other people that are watching that chat for me. So I can focus on hosting the meeting and then have somebody else there that's watching the chat and bringing up those questions as we go. And I don't know, Angie, if you've had that where the chat piles up and it gets a little overwhelming.
It can get extremely overwhelming. So that's a great point. If I know I'm going to be presenting, you got to work as a team, and it's okay. It's actually better. It makes you more comfortable because it's just one less thing for you to worry about and to help delegate and spread that manage load, because as Abby mentioned, there are way over 100 chats right now, and oh my gosh, if I had to manage that and do this, I couldn't do it. And so it's really important to tag team and make it a partnership to manage those chats and questions.
So we're getting into this, having a lot of content. So in the chat, and then maybe there's somebody that's taking over the conversation on Zoom, and they're filling a lot of that time either with their questions or, or just in the chat, they're overwhelming it. Now, Lee, do you have any thoughts on what would you do if somebody's kind of taking things over? How do you take it from that one person conversation into inclusive of everybody that's on that call?
That's another challenge that I'm still trying to figure out. I don't really necessarily have a great answer for that one. I tend to let people go, and the same thing happens in live meetings, is that person is trying to say something. So if it fits in the context, okay, try to spin it into the context and then open it up to the audience. But if it's sometimes these are outside of the presentation and they're beyond what's trying to be shared, the message is no longer there, then I try to acknowledge that, because if you don't acknowledge that person, they're probably going to continue. I try to acknowledge it and set it aside and say, that's a great point. It doesn't fit with what I'm saying now, but we can talk about that later. And I try to push it off to that type of thing. As far as, because if you don't acknowledge them, I've seen it, they continue to interrupt.
Yeah, that's a great point. You really don't ignore. I mean, their questions are just as valid as anyone else. But yeah, absolutely, they can be off topic, and like Lee mentioned, I take a pretty passive side, whereas hey, let's you and I talk about that, after a bit one-on-one and address that and work through it, because right now it just doesn't fit, and it's a lot easier said than done. So I have to admit that it takes some practice, because it can totally throw off your scheme and what you're working. For example, if you're doing a face-to-face cafe talk with Abby and you get these questions coming in, and all of a sudden there's a curveball from left field coming in, and you don't expect it and you're not ready for it. And so it takes some practice, but really just to acknowledge it. Yes, I hear you, and let's follow up before we leave today, and let's see how I can help you then. So
I think it could be helpful as a host of a meeting. So when you host a Zoom meeting, you can end meeting for all, right? I mean, you can click that red button at the end and just call it a day. Or the other option would be that you could clearly state that the meeting is over, so that you're not going to cover any more content specifically, but you're going to hang around for 10 minutes afterwards. And that's kind of the hangout after a meeting is over, right? I mean, you can stay on Zoom for a little bit longer. You cannot end that meeting right away. And you can take some of those questions, some of those oddball things that maybe don't apply to everybody at the meeting, but that person would like an answer. So that's always an option too. Don't be so quick to leave the meeting on Zoom or in person. I mean, it's good to stick around in person as well. So I think that's a good approach. And we've got a couple more questions here. Icebreakers, this is a good one. Most people groan at the thought of icebreakers. Do they actually engage the audience? And I don't know, Lee or Angie, let's direct that question towards Angie first, and then we'll see what Lee thinks about that.
I am one of those people that absolutely groan at the thought of having to use icebreakers. I don't like them, but I've come to learn now on Zoom, now more than ever. I didn't realize how much I need that human interaction when I do present, and so they do have a place, but I think we need to be a little bit more intentional with them now that we use them in Zoom, more than just my name is Angie Johnson and this is what I do. I think it's an opportunity for us to get to know each other a little bit better. Again, going back to that trust, not necessarily I'm ready to spill my guts and confide in you, but maybe just be able to know a little bit more about you. Hey, do you raise sheep? Well, so do I. So now we have something in common. And so just getting to know someone a little bit better. So I do think, unfortunately, they do have their place. We just need to be very intentional and specific on how we use them. Someone had mentioned the last time we met at our communication workshop that they called them, instead of icebreakers, community builders. And I think that stuck with me ever since we met, because that's truly what they should be, is how do we build the community that we have on Zoom and get those relationships to start budding and keep them throughout our lives.
So Lee, what have you done for an icebreaker? Have you done anything like that before?
No, but I do. Again, I'm kind of with Angie. I'm not a huge fan of the icebreakers. I like to bring in a specific conversation with a person or two, but I think it's important to realize where you're at and how big your meeting is. Like, this meeting is currently pushing 200 people. So to try to have an icebreaker benefit into that is really difficult. Now, I think the whole who are you and where you're from in the chat is a really good idea, but also I saw in the chat people were talking about stamping in some way that they can just click on where they're from and they don't have to interact. I thought that was a really, really good point. And so I think there's probably some other things like that. And if anybody else has ideas, please put those into the chat. But I see a question that I want Abby to answer. The anonymous person here says, we're acknowledging, in the age of Zoom meetings, that people are doing other things. They're scrolling Twitter, they're checking their emails, they're doing all this other kind of stuff. Their attention's getting divided, even more so than in a person meeting. And I think you have a lot to say for this, Abby, especially the formats of meetings you've chosen. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I think a lot of the way we've readjusted our formatting for delivering programs is because I would be at home doing Zoom, whether it's hosting a meeting or attending a meeting. I'd be distracted by 5,000 other things going on, my phone ringing, the text happening, my 5-year-old running around in circles, losing a frog in my bedroom at one point. So I think, I felt really distracted, and I needed something that had different interactions, that was more than just watching a Zoom screen. So that's why we came up with the live host things that we've been doing with the DIRT workshop prior to this, and also that communication workshop. So for me, this works because I like to see different things. I like to see videos. I like to see different scenes, different zooming into the camera on different levels. For me, that keeps me engaged and keeps me, away from looking at other things or being distracted. So I think the more that we can introduce those different medias into what we're doing, I think the better off we'll be. Now, not everybody can go out and shoot 30-some videos in the field like we did for the DIRT workshop and then bring those in. And I mean, that was a lot of work, but I think you can, take short videos of you talking about something in the field and show that for 2 minutes during a meeting to mix things up. And I think that can be really effective. So So that's what I've done. And fortunately, we've had a lot of luck with one of our sponsors for this, HB Sound, in doing this in this kind of format to deliver these programs weekly. I don't know if anybody else, if Angie, if you have a different style that you do now to keep people engaged.
Yeah, it's tough. I've really struggled. I've learned that I've struggled to stay focused. What was so different between in-person versus the Zoom meetings? In person, my phone is off. I don't check it. All of my energy is focused on what I'm doing. And I've learned I need to respect that and do the same thing for Zooms, because I'm just trying to do way too much at once. And it's just not working. I'm not focused. I'm not getting what I need to. But then again, sometimes the presenter has more than one message they're trying to get across. So then it's Zoom and information overload. And so it's really, I've got to be more intentional. If I'm going to be on a Zoom, that is what I'm going to do. The email, shut those email notifications off. That's huge. Don't let them be on the side. I've actually gotten to the point where I silence my cell phone, and that was really hard for me to do, to just shut that. I don't shut it off, but I just put it on silent so it's not that interruption, and really be intentional and focus in on what's being presented.
Gosh, so one conversation that Lee and I had, it was a couple weeks ago when we were trying to figure out these workshops that we were going to do, whether it's this communication one or the one later today, Soil Talk Tuesday. And I think this workshop was initially set aside for an hour and a half. And then the one this afternoon, I had 2 hours blocked off for that. And I was talking with Lee, and he said, Abby, not every Zoom meeting has to be an hour or two. You can make it shorter, and you can make it a drop-in thing. And so that's another thing you could do with your programming is you don't have to make a meeting an hour long. Like say, if we were done getting questions right now, we would just end the meeting because we don't need to hang around and keep things going and dragging on. And the same for the afternoon, instead of doing 2 hours for that meeting in the afternoon, which farmers aren't going to have time for, shortening it up to really the meat of the content is in the first 30 minutes, and then there's another 30 minutes to kind of follow up. And then if we go further, we can extend it another 10 to 20 minutes, but keeping it flexible and not trying to fill a time slot, but actually focus on that content, like Angie was saying. Let's see here, Zoom fatigue from adjustment from in-person. Now we have a ton of meetings online. Yes, we do. And how do we adjust for that? I don't know, Lee, do you have some advice on all this volume of Zoom meetings and how do you handle it?
Well, I think what you were saying there, Abby, is, if the Zoom meetings are moving to the point where the meat and potatoes part is in the beginning, and then if you want to hang around longer, then I think that helps. But the other thing is, I think we need to be a little bit selective. We can say no, and you don't have to go to every Zoom meeting. You don't have to be part of the whole thing. You don't need to hang around the entire time. This is what's happened with me this winter, is that I've had way more meetings than I could ever have done before. And when I'm traveling to give a presentation, and say I'm going to fly to Ontario to give a presentation, I got a day of travel, I got a day there, and I got a day coming home. It's basically 3 days for that meeting. Now I can have 4 meetings in one day, and I could do that all along. And 1 week in December, I had 9 Zoom meetings. I should have said no to a few of those. It was just too much. So I think part of that is just understanding that we don't have to be at all of these, and several of them are going to be recorded, or there's going to be notes on it, or you can talk to other people. Be cognizant of overtaxing yourself is another thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Pace yourself with Zoom meetings. Don't overdo it. And you know what? Pick up the phone. Like, the phone still works. I may have mine on silent, so if I don't answer, I'll get back to you. But I have had more phone conversations than I feel like I've had in my career here now, with the experiences that we've had. And so going back to what we know and what we use, a phone call or a text message is A-okay. So be able to take some time, because Zoom fatigue is real. We're working so hard to read our audience, and we're doing way too many meetings all at once, and it is real. So don't be afraid to pace yourself, take some time, give yourself breaks too. That's the other thing is, If you are going to be at a long meeting or a program, make sure there's scheduled breaks so people can at least go to the restroom, for Pete's sake. So it's really no different than our face-to-face meetings. We give breaks for restrooms, snacks, whatever, just to stretch. And so Zoom is really no different. We need to be cognizant of that as well.
Just going to say one more point on that was in the chat box, is that some people were recommending just having some frequently asked questions that you normally have to start that off, and maybe you introduce it yourself, and then you introduce the question and then you answer it and give people time to add more questions. I thought that was a good idea too.
That's a great idea. And maybe after this meeting, I should share the notes that we put together with those planted questions for this actual workshop. So you can see the first half hour, we didn't have a lot of questions, but the ones that we did have and were asking were ones that we planted, that we pulled from the workshop in December. We pulled those into the script, I guess, if you want to call it that. And then I could share those notes with people so that they can see what it is like to prepare for a meeting like this. That there's no shame in being fully prepared, over prepared in some cases, and then waiting for those questions to roll in the Q&A to start answering those. So I think making sure that you use as many tools as you have available to you as possible and as much preparation as possible, it can be a really good thing. Now we also have a question here about Zoom polls is a good idea for a community builder. So I don't use Zoom polls that often. I don't know, Angie or Lee, if you use them. I use more Twitter polls to do community builders, but I think Zoom polls could be helpful. You could ask questions in there and use as a community builder.
Gonna do that, you need to have a co-host managing that, because otherwise you're gonna get lost in that. So if you're gonna have polls or some of those sideline icebreakers where somebody has to be collecting or aggregating some data for you, make sure you've got a co-host with you.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because you can have too much information coming in and too many things going on that can sway the conversation one way or another. We do have about 10 minutes left in this conversation, and I think maybe it would be a good idea, and this is something that Tim Hamrich did as a co-host last month for these workshops, is he asked each of the panel members, is there any additional, one item that you want people to take away, that one takeaway from this meeting? And so maybe let's go around and do that. We'll start with Lee. What is a takeaway that you'd like to have from this meeting for everybody to remember?
Well, I think we've covered it, maybe not specifically, but understanding that the meeting, you're trying to convey a message. It should be a pretty direct message. Try to be entertaining, but start with the bulk of it up front, and understand that all the tools that you're using, whether they're a video or they're your PowerPoint slides or whatever you're using, is tools to tell the story. The point of it is the story. So if your tools aren't quite working right or something's not going wrong, that's fine. Just try to make sure you tell your story, but do keep it to one. Having too many things going on at one is really overloading.
Yeah, and let's go to Angie. Do you have a final tip that you want to?
Yeah, just remember, Zoom does not define who you are. We have to, each and every one of us is here for a reason. Agriculture is our passion. Feeding the world and feeding the people is what our drive is every morning to get up, and that doesn't change just because we're doing this over Zoom. And so you really need to step back, be who you are, showcase your passion. I get pretty intense when I'm in a face-to-face presentation. I really get into it. I put my heart and soul into it, and that should not change just because we're doing this over Zoom. And so be who you are, embrace it, enjoy it, have fun with it, and life's a dance. You learn as you go. I've made a lot of mistakes on Zoom, and I'm getting better, though. It's getting to become more comfortable for me, and so you just got to keep practicing and don't give up. And yeah, I'm going to have to learn how to use a community builder and get better about utilizing that and enjoy it. It's been a great opportunity to meet new people and get more folks involved in the great work we do.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway for this is don't be scared to try different and new things. A lot of times we don't like seeing ourselves on camera. We don't like how we look on Zoom. But to just get comfortable with that, because that is the new world. So if you're nervous about doing videos in the field because you don't like the way you look, figure out that camera angle and that selfie that makes you look good. Create those multiple formats, those ways that can keep people engaged. throw in some video, have maybe 1 or 2 slides. Don't do a full PowerPoint. I think that's distracting. I know also if you're going to invite people to join a meeting, a panel format's really great. All they have to do is log on. They don't have to pre-record a session. They don't have to create a PowerPoint. All they have to do is show up. And for me, I really appreciate that opportunity to just show up and share the information I have and not have to prepare anything, especially as we get into a lot of different Zoom meetings and obligations there. So I think just don't be scared to try new things. If for you, for example, for me, the technology part's the part I don't like. I don't like coordinating whether people can log on or having them text me and say, I can't log on, what do I do? So I found a company to do that for me. So that was my biggest fear in all these Zoom meetings. I don't like sharing screens. I don't like dealing with IT stuff. So for me, I could take that off my plate by hiring a company to live host these things, and then I could just focus on the content and do what I want to do and create the different types of content in different formats. So I think it's important to recognize the things you want to deal with and things you don't want to deal with. And then, as Lee and I talked before this, a shorter meeting sometimes is better than that longer one. You have just as much impact with a short meeting as you do a long one. So keep it short, keep that content up front like Lee was saying, and don't be scared to use different approaches.